In the period preceding the Six-Day War, Naomi Shemer's Yerushalayim Shel Zahav gripped the state of Israel. Talks about the walls of gold, the beautiful walls of Jerusalem. And you know what? For 19 years, those walls were like an iron wall, keeping out the Jews from our home in the old city of Jerusalem. Now, 47 years since the reunification of Jerusalem, those same walls have gathered us in, have hugged us, have kept us close to home. Because a wall has two purposes. A wall can keep unwanteds out, keep the enemies outside the gates. It can keep unwanted animals out of one's property or away. A wall makes a separation. But there's another purpose to a wall. And that wall is to keep things in, to delineate a boundary and not have that go over that boundary. Certain things like Maaser Sheni and certain korbanot offerings that could not leave the boundary of Jerusalem. A wall has two purposes, to keep in and to keep out. And it's that message of making boundaries for that dual purpose that we find in this week's Parsha, Parshat Nasso. The main topics that this Parsha deals with are finishing up the charges of the Levi'im with the families of Gershon and Merari, also including 4 other main areas, including Tarat HaMachaneh, the purification and making sure that ritually the camp of Israel is pure, and then the mitzvah of Sotah, a woman who is suspected of adultery by her husband and has no way to substantiate her claim of fidelity. The Nazir, the Nazarite, takes a special vow and abstains from physical pleasures as a result of seeing what happens to the Sotah. And then really 2 other topics at the end of this week's Parsha. Birkat Kohanim, the blessing of the Kohanim that is also given not only every day in Israel and at Musaf on the Chagim outside Israel, but also the same blessing is actually given by the father to his children on Friday night. That appears in this week's Parsha. And finally, just really a 5th topic, the korbanot of the Nisi'im, the sacrifices of the princes that were brought at the inauguration of the Mishkan, which historically took place the first year, or really at the beginning of technically the 2nd year of Bnei Yisrael's journey into the desert, either taking place from the 1st of Nisan to the 12th, or from the 7th of Nisan to the 19th, that being a point of dispute. Let's take a deeper look into the details of this week's Parsha, and we're going to see how important boundaries, both for the community and for our personal service of Hashem, both keeping things in and keeping things out, is so integral and is so central to this week's portion. After we have the final count of the Levi'im, which is a total of 8,580, the Parsha discusses the purification of the camp and making sure that everyone in the camp, in the Machaneh, is tahor. So there's certain types of people that need to leave the camp, that can't stay within the camp, and you leave the boundary of the camp, leave the encampments that we talked about in so much detail in last week's Parsha. We have people like the Zav, who experiences an emission, or the Tzara'at, one who has leprosy, or even the most serious form of Tuma, the most serious form of impurity, which is Tumat Hamet, which is one who is impure from a dead body. All these types of people need to go out. We have a very clear boundary for the community of what's in and what's out. Every single person who's in the community has a responsibility. Everyone is in the tzava. Everyone is in God's legions. Most of Bnei Yisrael as soldiers, and the Levi'im as soldiers of Hashem, of soldiers of the temple who are working on the temple service. That is what's in. And then we also know what's out. Certain types of impurity and tum'ah can have no place in the camp of Israel. And then we move on to our personal service, our personal avodat Hashem, our personal service of God. And that's really typified by the Sotah and the Nazir. And let's explain why. There's a small halacha, just a couple of psukim, that appears before the Sotah, the parsha, the paragraph of the Sotah, who is the woman who is suspected of adultery and has no ways to substantiate the claim. There's a certain matanot kahuna, certain gifts that are given to the Kohanim. And one is obligated to give those gifts to the Kohanim. Chazal tell us that. Why is this small halacha about gifts to the Kohanim juxtaposed to the halacha of Sotah? What's it doing here? Chazal tell us that one who does not bring the gifts to the Kohanim will ultimately have to see the Kohen under much more uncomfortable circumstances, under the circumstances of suspecting his wife as an adulterer. Now, the whole system of the Sotah is a number of specific halachot, a number of specific steps that we find in the psukim. There's a special korban that she brings, a minchat knaot, a meal offering. There's also a vidui that she does, a confession over it. And there's also a part where the Sotah, where the woman is, which is degraded, her hair is undone, her braids are undone, her hair is let out, part of her shirt is ripped, and she's publicly degraded. She has one last chance. There's one last chance before the parsha of the Sotah is thrown into the waters that she will then have to drink. And if she drinks the waters and she had committed adultery, then she suffers death miraculously by these waters. And if she had remained faithful to her husband, then she would be blessed with fertility and having many other children. The Nazir sees this. The person in the audience, he sees to what depths hedonism and the pursuit of pleasure can take man. He sees what's happening to this woman. And Chazal tell us that the reason for the juxtaposition of the Nazir and the Sotah is someone could be there, seeing this woman being degraded, seeing to what depths our ta'avot, our desire, a physical desire, sometimes take us. He's taken aback. He needs to step back. He takes a step back from those physical pleasures by making a special neder, a special vow of being a Nazir. A Nazirite vow, he's not cutting his hair. He's not having any grape products. Forget about wine. But he's not even having grapes themselves, or anything derived from that grape. And he's also remaining ritually pure, and he's not becoming tamei meit. He's not becoming impure from a dead person. He takes this special vow, and he removes himself from those physical pleasures. He understands that we need to have boundaries. We understand there's certain things that just can't be in. There's certain sometimes that, you know what, we need to take a stand, and we need to make a boundary. Certain pleasures cannot be entertained. Certain pleasures don't have a place, and he makes that boundary. It's a dispute among the commentaries whether the Nazir is on a higher spiritual level, and that is a lichatchila, it's an a priori thing, or is that an ex post facto law, where if he really can't control his desires, then he's becoming a Nazir. But nonetheless, what the Nazir does accomplish is making a boundary and knowing what should come into his life and what should not come into his life. Following the Parsha of the Nazir, we have Birkat Kohanim, where we have the mitzvah d'oraita, the mitzvah from the Torah, for the Kohen to bless the nation. So done in the Beit HaMikdash. As I mentioned before, it's also done every day in Eretz Yisrael, during the morning, during Shacharit, during the morning prayer, and in Chutz La'aretz, outside Israel, it's done during the Chagim at Musaf. Now, so too, the blessing of the Kohanim, there's actually many different ways to understand them. In general, either it's a physical blessing of wealth, of joy and pleasure, and also being able to Hashem should guard those gifts that He gives us and resources that He gives us, or it's a blessing of spiritual wealth. But nonetheless, whether we're being blessed with physical or spiritual wealth, we still have those boundaries. And there's still those boundaries that we drew on a communal level with the purity of the camp, or on a personal level with the reaction of the Nazir to the Sotah. The reaction of the Nazir of just taking a step back and making a boundary, even if it might be a bit stringent. He's making a boundary, and he's making sure that not everything gets through, and he's being discerning. However, there's a danger in that. The danger of having very strong boundaries, of having a very boxed structure, is that it becomes stale. If one doesn't, how is it possible in such a structured religious experience of 613 mitzvot, plus all the rabbinic mitzvot, with myriad details, how is it possible for one to also personally express his own connection with God, his own spirituality? Where is there any room for spiritual specialization in such a structured format? And even though we have those very, very strong boundaries at a communal level and a personal level, there's still room for one to also be able to express himself spiritually. And that's the end of this week's Parsha. Now, it actually is over 80 psukim describing the korbanot, describing the sacrifices that the Nisi'im, the princes of Israel, of one for each tribe, on behalf of each tribe, brought at the inauguration of the Mishkan. And there's a very odd thing. Why are the korbanot, why are the sacrifices of each of these princes being enumerated in the Torah? The Torah doesn't mince, or the Torah is very, very clear and concise in its language. Why does it go so verbosely describe the same exact sacrifice for each of the 12 princes? The Ramban has a beautiful idea. The Ramban explains that even though each and one of them have their own structure, have the same exact korban, each of them was able to infuse it with their own meaning, was able to infuse it with their own ideas. Even though we, as parents, we need to give clear boundaries to our kids, and as a community, there need to be clear red lines for our kids. Nonetheless, we should know that within Judaism, within our structure, there's ample room for self-expression of our own spiritual connection with God. And that is done through the kavanot, through the intent that one has while doing mitzvot, through one's perspective. And that perspective is really what we need to impart to our kids. The importance of having boundaries, the importance of knowing what to let in and what to keep out, and at the same time, while you're in, to be able to have a healthy perspective and healthy self-expression of our connection with our Father in heaven.